The explosions did not sound like signals inside B-59. They sounded like war. On October 27, 1962, repeated detonations pressed through the steel hull of the Soviet Project 641 submarine near Cuba, shaking pipes, instruments, and exhausted men who could not tell whether the Cuban Missile Crisis was still being contained or had already become open conflict. Battery power was falling. Ventilation was inadequate. Heat and humidity had turned the compartments into oppressive metal chambers, and reliable communication with Moscow had become uncertain. Captain Second Rank Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky commanded B-59 and carried responsibility for the submarine, its crew, and its weapons. Aboard with him was Captain Second Rank Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov, 36 years old and Chief of Staff of the Soviet Northern Fleet's 69th Submarine Brigade. One weapon made their situation unlike an ordinary anti-submarine encounter. B-59 carried a special torpedo fitted with a nuclear warhead. If the officers believed that war had begun, using it against the American force above could turn a local naval clash into an escalation neither government could easily control. Later testimony indicates that Savitsky considered nuclear action and that preparations involving the special torpedo were ordered or discussed. The same testimony describes Arkhipov opposing that course and helping redirect the decision towards surfacing. The exact sequence remains disputed. Sources differ over the approval procedure, whether a formal vote occurred, how far the weapon moved toward readiness, and which words were spoken in the control room. What the evidence supports is narrower, but still extraordinary. Arkhipov did not control a solitary firing switch, yet his authority and refusal to support nuclear use mattered when fear, exhaustion, and isolation were narrowing the submarine's options. To understand how B-59 reached that moment, the story must return to mid-October 1962. American reconnaissance photographs had revealed Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, about 90 miles from Florida. President John F. Kennedy now faced a strategic crisis. The missiles could reduce warning time for attacks against much of the United States, while an American attempt to remove them risked direct conflict with the Soviet Union. Kennedy rejected an immediate airstrike or invasion as his first response, but he also refused to accept the deployment without action. On October 22nd, he announced a naval quarantine around Cuba, a term chosen to avoid the legal and political meaning of declaring a blockade. United States naval forces moved to intercept shipping carrying prohibited military equipment, and military readiness increased across commands. Soviet forces prepared for confrontation as well. Washington and Moscow exchanged warnings and private messages while trying to defend national credibility without losing control. Each side feared appearing weak. Each also understood that a clash involving ships, aircraft, or local commanders could move faster than diplomacy. B-59 operated inside that dangerous gap between strategic intention and battlefield perception. Its crew could not hear the discussions between Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. They did not know which compromises were being considered or whether the next explosion against the hull was merely a signal. The Americans above intended to force an unidentified submarine to surface, not announce the beginning of war. But intention on the surface meant little if the men below could not understand it. By Black Saturday, exhaustion, isolation, and incomplete information had brought Savitsky and Arkhipov toward a decision that might affect far more than one submarine. The danger was not that either side wanted a submarine commander to decide the fate of the crisis. The danger was that political intention had been separated from tactical experience. Above the sea, the explosions belonged to an approved signaling procedure. Below it, they arrived without explanation inside a boat that carried a nuclear weapon. That gap between meaning and perception became the central engine of the story. The confrontation around B-59 had been building since the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961. The operation convinced Cuban leader Fidel Castro that the United States might again try to remove his government by force. For Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Cuba became both a vulnerable ally and a strategic opportunity. The Soviet Union faced an unfavorable balance in immediately available nuclear forces, while the United States had deployed Jupiter medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey and Italy, close to Soviet territory. Khrushchev decided that placing Soviet strategic missiles in Cuba could strengthen the island's defense, alter the nuclear balance, and answer American deployments near the Soviet frontier. The secret movement of troops, missiles, aircraft, air defense systems, and nuclear forces received the deliberately misleading code name Operation Nadir, suggesting a destination in the far Soviet northeast rather than the Caribbean. Cargoes were concealed, personnel received limited information, and many servicemen learned their destination only after their ships were already at sea. American intelligence detected unusual Soviet activity, but the decisive evidence came from reconnaissance photographs taken in October 1962. Analysts identified missile sites under construction, and President Kennedy was informed on October 16th. He assembled the Executive Committee of the National Security Council to examine military and diplomatic options. Its members considered limited air strikes, a broader attack, invasion, diplomatic pressure, and a naval response. None offered certainty. An airstrike might miss some missiles and kill Soviet personnel. An invasion could bring American troops into direct combat with Soviet forces whose full capabilities in Cuba were not yet known. Diplomacy without pressure might allow the missile sites to become operational. Kennedy therefore selected a naval quarantine as the first major step. On October 22nd, he announced the missile discovery and the American response in a televised address. United States ships established interception lines, military commands increased readiness, and Soviet vessels approaching Cuba faced possible diversion or inspection. Yet the crisis was never controlled by Kennedy and Khrushchev alone. Pilots, air defense officers, destroyer captains, submarine commanders, and communications personnel all operated under incomplete information. A technical failure, misunderstood order, or local decision could produce an escalation neither leader intended. Hidden inside the larger Soviet deployment was Operation Comma, the naval mission assigned to 4 Project 641 diesel-electric submarines of the Northern Fleet's 69th Submarine Brigade, B-4, B-36, B-59, and B-130. At 4 o'clock on the morning of October 1st, 1962, they departed from Saida Harbor in the Kola Bay region under strict secrecy. According to declassified Soviet naval records, each carried conventional torpedoes and 1 special nuclear-armed torpedo. The weapon was part of the submarine's assigned wartime armament for a distant and secret mission. Its presence did not mean Moscow had ordered an attack on the United States Navy or granted unlimited authority to use it whenever detection occurred. The United States Navy knew Soviet submarines were moving toward the area, but did not know with certainty that nuclear torpedoes were aboard. That intelligence gap shaped everything that followed. American anti-submarine forces believed they were conducting a difficult but conventional search, while the Soviet crews understood that any confrontation might involve a weapon with strategic consequences. Savitsky commanded B-59. Arkhipov sailed aboard as brigade chief of staff, not as the submarine's regular captain. Their mission demanded secrecy, endurance, and disciplined communication. The voyage began undermining all 3. As the 4 boats moved from northern waters into the warmer Atlantic, internal temperatures rose, equipment came under strain, and American surveillance steadily intensified. Operation Comma also placed extraordinary responsibility on commanders far from Soviet support. The boats were expected to avoid detection, preserve secrecy, and operate near a rapidly changing confrontation. Their orders could not anticipate every encounter with American ships. Because the submarines were diesel-electric rather than nuclear-powered, the mission's political secrecy depended on machinery that eventually required exposure. The same design that allowed the boats to travel long distances also created the weakness American forces would exploit. Operation Comma's 4 submarines crossed the North Atlantic in boats designed for conditions very different from those they encountered near Cuba. Project 641 submarines, known to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization as the Foxtrot class, were diesel-electric vessels. Their diesel engines could propel the boats and recharge the batteries only when they were on the surface or moving at shallow depth with a snorkel raised. Once submerged, they depended on stored electrical power. That design created a dangerous cycle. Remaining underwater reduced the risk of detection by radar, aircraft, and surface ships, but every hour below drained the batteries and worsened the atmosphere inside. Surfacing or snorkeling restored power, yet exposed the submarine to the very forces hunting it. The warm Sargasso Sea and Atlantic approaches to Cuba intensified the problem. Boats developed for northern waters no longer benefited from cold seas that helped control internal temperature. Heat accumulated around engines, batteries, electrical equipment, weapons, provisions, and crowded living spaces. Humidity remained high. Fresh water was rationed. Clothing stayed damp. Sleep became difficult, and ordinary maintenance grew harder whenever the crew had to remain silent. Equipment failures affected pumps, ventilation, radio systems, and other machinery already operating under strain. On B-59, Captain Second Rank Valentin Savitsky remained responsible for preserving the submarine, completing the mission, and deciding when concealment became more dangerous than exposure. Captain Second Rank Vasily Arkhipov held a different role. As Chief of Staff of the 69th Submarine Brigade, he possessed senior authority and experience that extended beyond the routine command structure of one boat. Political officer Ivan Maslenikov also served aboard, while Signals Intelligence Officer Vadim Orlov later provided testimony about conditions inside B-59. Surviving accounts agree that the environment became severe, although exact temperatures and air quality measurements differ and should not be treated as certain. The crew endured oppressive heat, poor ventilation, physical exhaustion, and deteriorating air while attempting to avoid detection. Radio contact offered little relief. Receiving long-range messages often required the submarine to approach the surface and expose an antenna, which could reveal its position. Messages might arrive late, incomplete, or difficult to interpret. The officers knew the United States had established a quarantine and that American forces were searching for Soviet submarines. They did not have continuous access to the diplomatic exchanges between Moscow and Washington, and they could not know whether an incident elsewhere had changed the situation. Every period of silence widened the gap between what the crew believed and what was actually happening. Meanwhile, American anti-submarine forces organized an increasingly systematic search. Patrol aircraft crossed broad sectors of ocean with radar and specialized sensors. Destroyers and carrier-based aircraft worked together to detect, classify, and follow underwater contacts. A Foxtrot could maneuver, change depth, and attempt to break contact, but its batteries imposed a strict time limit. Once detected, it could be followed until declining power forced it toward the surface. B-59 was entering that trap. To remain submerged meant preserving secrecy while spending air, electricity, and human endurance. To rise meant exposing the boat to a naval force whose intentions the Soviet crew could not confidently judge. As American ships and aircraft tightened their search near the quarantine zone, machinery and isolation were turning a naval tracking operation into a crisis of survival and command. The crew's burden was therefore not only physical. It was cognitive. Officers had to interpret fragmentary sonar contacts, delayed messages, mechanical reports, and the behavior of an unseen adversary while their own endurance declined. A minor sound could suggest a change in the pursuit. A failed component could remove an escape option. The submarine's architecture concentrated these pressures inside narrow compartments where command decisions, technical problems, and human exhaustion could not be separated. Around the quarantine line, the United States Navy built a layered anti-submarine search rather than a single coordinated attack. Carrier-centered task groups used destroyers, patrol aircraft, helicopters, radar, sonar, and visual observation to locate Soviet submarines and keep contact once a boat had been found. USS Randolph served as the center of one anti-submarine carrier group, and destroyers including USS Beale participated in operations involving B-59. The American crews knew Soviet diesel-electric submarines were near Cuba, but they did not know with certainty that any of them carried a nuclear weapon. Their procedures, therefore, assumed a conventional encounter. Washington had authorized the use of small explosive signaling devices, including practice depth charges and other recorded signaling charges, to direct an unidentified submarine to surface for identification. These devices were not intended to destroy the boat. American officials tried to communicate the procedure through diplomatic channels, but a message sent to a government did not guarantee that a submerged crew at sea had received or understood it. Operation Comma's submarines were under strict communication limits. Even if notice reached the Soviet side, officers inside a steel hull still had to distinguish a signal from an attack while hearing explosions through water, machinery, and sonar interference. B-59 continued to evade. Savitsky changed course and depth, attempting to complicate tracking while conserving battery power. Crewmen reduced noise and listened for propeller movements above. Every maneuver consumed energy. Approaching periscope depth might improve awareness or permit communication, but it also increased the risk of detection by aircraft and radar. Sonar could reveal bearings and movement. It could not explain political intention. The American destroyer crews faced a different uncertainty. They were trying to maintain contact with a submarine that altered depth and direction and refused to identify itself. From their perspective, signaling charges offered a controlled way to compel the contact upward without using destructive weapons. From below, the same charges arrived as repeated shocks against the hull. Equipment vibrated, loose objects shifted, and exhausted sailors had no direct way to know the purpose of each detonation. The Americans believed they were sending instructions. The Soviet crew could not confidently know whether the explosions marked signaling, intimidation, or the opening stage of combat. Both sides acted within procedures that appeared reasonable from their own positions, yet neither understood the full risk. The United States Navy did not know B-59 carried a special nuclear torpedo. The officers aboard B-59 did not know whether the charges were non-lethal signals or whether war had begun elsewhere. By October 27th, several emergencies were developing at once. An American reconnaissance aircraft would be shot down over Cuba. Another aircraft would accidentally enter Soviet airspace. Messages from Khrushchev presented shifting terms for settlement, forcing Kennedy and his advisors to judge which proposal represented Moscow's position. Military forces remained at heightened readiness, and local commanders acted under incomplete guidance. Beneath the surface, B-59 was approaching the limits of concealment. Its batteries were weakening, communication remained unreliable, and the crew's endurance was failing. Above, USS Randolph's group and participating destroyers continued the effort to force the submarine upward. As Black Saturday began, political crisis, naval pursuit, communication failure, and a hidden nuclear weapon were converging without either government fully understanding how close they had come to one another. The American procedure had its own logic. A submerged submarine near a quarantine line could not simply be ignored, and destroying an unidentified contact would have carried grave risks. Signaling charges appear to offer a middle course between allowing the boat to remain hidden and attacking it with lethal weapons. Yet that compromise depended on shared understanding. Once the meaning of the signal failed to reach B-59, a measure intended to reduce danger became another source of it. October 27, 1962, became dangerous because several military events were moving faster than political leaders could fully control. Over Cuba, a United States U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down while monitoring Soviet missile sites, increasing pressure on President Kennedy and the executive committee at the moment they were still searching for a negotiated solution. Elsewhere, another American reconnaissance aircraft accidentally entered Soviet airspace, creating a separate risk of interception and confrontation. Strategic commands on both sides were operating at heightened readiness. Aircraft, ships, missile units, and air defense forces prepared for missions that could be mistaken for the beginning of a broader attack. In Washington, reports arrived incomplete or delayed. In Moscow, Khrushchev faced the same problem from the opposite side. Neither leader could observe every local action undertaken in his name. A pilot, ship captain, submarine commander, or air defense officer could create consequences that political leaders would have only minutes to interpret. B-59 was trapped inside that pattern. United States destroyers maintained sonar contact and continued releasing signaling charges while aircraft helped hold the submarine's position. Inside the boat, those actions did not arrive as clearly labeled instructions. They arrived as underwater explosions, propeller noise, and the persistent presence of an American naval force overhead. The crew had no reliable radio picture of the wider crisis. They did not know whether the loss of the U-2 had already produced retaliation or whether another incident had turned confrontation into war. Savitsky continued trying to protect the submarine and preserve the mission. Surfacing would expose B-59 to direct observation and possible action by ships and aircraft whose intentions remained uncertain. A commander trained to avoid detection could not treat that decision lightly. He ordered evasive maneuvers and efforts to conserve what electrical power remained. Yet those same actions reduced the boat's endurance. The batteries approached a critical state. Ventilation remained restricted. The air became harder to breathe, and exhaustion affected both machinery and men. Arkhipov observed the pattern from his position as brigade chief of staff. His senior role did not give him access to information the boat did not possess. He could listen to sonar reports and consider the fact that the submarine had not suffered a clearly lethal attack, but he could not know the Americans' exact intentions. No reliable message from Moscow confirmed that diplomacy remained active. The pressure on Savitsky was therefore cumulative rather than irrational. He commanded a nuclear-armed submarine, cut off from higher authority, surrounded by an adversary, and unable to remain hidden indefinitely. The Americans did not know they were pressing a submarine carrying a nuclear weapon. The Soviet officers did not know the Americans believed they were following a controlled signaling procedure. Each side was acting from a different version of the encounter. As the hours passed, B-59's choices narrowed. Remaining submerged protected the submarine from direct observation, but risked battery failure and worsening air. Surfacing offered ventilation and recharging, but it meant entering an unknown confrontation under American searchlights and weapons. A third option was more dangerous. Prepare the special torpedo for possible use if Savitsky concluded that war had already begun. By then, the crisis had ceased to be only a struggle for concealment. It had become a command decision involving survival, military duty, and a weapon whose consequences could not be contained within the waters around B-59. The timing made every interpretation more dangerous. The crew could not know that Kennedy was resisting pressure for immediate military retaliation after the U-2 loss, or that Khrushchev was still seeking a settlement. They experienced only the local evidence available inside the hull. Savitsky's problem was not simply whether to fight or surrender. It was whether surfacing would protect the crew, expose the mission, or place the submarine helplessly before an enemy that might already be at war. By the final submerged hours of October 27th, B-59 had become a sealed chamber of heat, fatigue, and incomplete information. Reduced lighting left faces partly illuminated by instrument lamps, while crewmen tracked depth, course, battery condition, and sonar bearings. Ventilation was inadequate, machinery was under strain, and the atmosphere worsened as heat, humidity, and rising carbon dioxide reduced concentration. Exact measurements differ among later accounts, but the surviving record consistently describes conditions severe enough to affect endurance and judgment. Outside the hull, explosions continued. Sonar operators could report propeller movements and changing bearings, but they could not explain what American commanders intended. The crew had no reliable confirmation that the charges were signals rather than attack. and no dependable news from Moscow about whether the wider crisis remained under control. Savitsky therefore faced the situation as a submarine commander isolated from higher authority and nearing the limits of his boat's ability to remain submerged. According to later Soviet testimony, he came to believe that hostilities might already have begun and ordered or discussed preparations involving the special nuclear-armed torpedo. The surviving record does not establish whether the weapon was fully armed, whether a target had been selected, how long the command dispute lasted, or how close the crew came to an executable launch sequence. Sources also differ over authorization. Some accounts describe a need for concurrence among senior officers aboard, including Savitsky, political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and Arkhipov. Other interpretations question whether this functioned as a formal three-man vote or whether Arkhipov's influence arose from his senior brigade position. The evidence does not support a simple 2-to-1 drama, a confirmed unanimous launch rule, or precise dialogue. What it does support is that nuclear use entered the command discussion at the most unstable moment of the pursuit. A detonation against the United States naval force would have crossed a threshold neither Washington nor Moscow had yet crossed. American commanders did not know with certainty that B-59 carried such a weapon. If it had been used, the United States would have faced a nuclear attack on its ships without knowing how widely the action had been authorized. Global nuclear war would not have been automatic, but the pressure for retaliation could have sharply reduced the possibility of control. Savitsky's judgment must be understood within the environment that produced it. He was not an irrational villain seeking destruction. He was responsible for an exhausted submarine, surrounded by foreign warships, unable to communicate reliably, and uncertain whether his country was already at war. Every option carried danger. Remaining submerged risked losing power and control. Surfacing meant exposing B-59 to possible capture, attack, or detention. Preparing the special weapon offered resistance if war had begun, but it also introduced consequences far beyond the submarine's survival. Arkhipov recognized that uncertainty could not be allowed to become proof. The available evidence indicates that he challenged the assumption that war had begun and pressed for surfacing before nuclear use was considered further. As Chief of Staff of the 69th Submarine Brigade, he brought senior authority and a broader command perspective into the control room. He could not know with certainty that the Americans were signaling, but he could argue that their pattern did not conclusively prove a lethal attack. The decision had to be slowed, questioned, and redirected before exhaustion and fear turned incomplete information into irreversible action. The special torpedo magnified every uncertainty because it compressed a strategic decision into the space of a submarine control room. The weapon offered no way to test an assumption or reverse the result after launch. Its possible use, therefore, demanded a higher standard than fear, damaged equipment, or the absence of communication. The central question was whether the officers possessed evidence strong enough to justify crossing a threshold that national leaders themselves were still trying to avoid. Inside B-59, the decisive change was the refusal to treat uncertainty as permission for nuclear use. Captain Second Rank Vasily Arkhipov opposed or withheld concurrence from the proposed employment of the special torpedo and pressed for the submarine to surface, identify the situation, and restore communication. He was not B-59's captain. That responsibility belonged to Captain Second Rank Valentin Savitsky. Arkhipov's authority came from his position as Chief of Staff of the 69th Submarine Brigade and from his status as a senior officer aboard the boat. The exact launch procedure remains disputed, but the surviving evidence supports the conclusion that his opposition affected the final command decision. Arkhipov did not refuse an order to press a firing switch because he was not the torpedo operator and did not personally control the mechanism. His refusal was a command act. He opposed, withheld support from, or declined to concur with the proposed nuclear action and used his authority to argue for surfacing instead. Later testimony suggests that he emphasized the absence of proof that war had begun. The explosions had not destroyed the submarine. and the American force appeared to be maintaining contact rather than carrying out an unmistakable lethal attack. That did not reveal American intentions with certainty, but it left open an alternative interpretation. Arkhipov's earlier service as executive officer aboard the Soviet nuclear submarine K-19 during its 1961 reactor accident provides context for his experience with nuclear risk and technical crisis. The record does not establish that he consciously compared K-19 with B-59 or reveal his private thoughts. It only shows that he had previously faced severe command pressure involving nuclear systems. Savitsky, meanwhile, should not be reduced to an antagonist. He carried direct responsibility for the submarine and had endured the same heat, isolation, failing air, and uncertainty as the crew. Surfacing could mean losing tactical control in front of a foreign naval formation. Considering the special Torpedo, according to later accounts, emerged from accumulated pressure and the belief that hostilities might already have begun. The command conflict was therefore not a contest between reason and madness. It was a confrontation between two interpretations of incomplete evidence. Arkhipov's contribution was to slow the process and insist that the boat still had one option not yet exhausted. B-59 could surface, accept exposure, and discover whether the encounter remained limited. Savitsky ultimately accepted that course. The choice did not guarantee safety. The submarine would emerge among destroyers and aircraft after hours of evasion, with the crew uncertain whether they would face warning fire, boarding, detention, or continued pursuit. Yet surfacing preserved the possibility of communication and restraint. Launching the Torpedo would have removed both. Operational judgment replaced assumption. Orders moved through the boat. Crewmen adjusted systems weakened by prolonged pursuit. Propulsion was controlled for ascent. Depth was reduced, and ballast procedures began changing the submarine's condition. Men prepared to leave darkness and pressure for direct exposure under searchlights and weapons. Above, American ships continued circling the contact, and aircraft remained overhead. Slowly, B-59 began rising toward the surface. Arkhipov's intervention mattered because it changed the pace of the decision. Nuclear use required movement toward finality. Surfacing created time. By arguing for ascent, he restored the possibility of observation, communication, and reassessment. Savitsky's acceptance was equally important. Command responsibility did not disappear because another officer objected. The captain still had to choose exposure over a weapon that could appear, in the moment, to offer resistance and survival. The decision also preserved the legitimacy of command. Arkhipov did not remove Savitsky from authority or replace him as captain. He influenced the judgment of the officer who remained responsible for B-59. Restraint emerged through command disagreement resolved before action, not through mutiny, physical intervention, or a single dramatic switch. B-59 broke the surface late on October 27, 1962, after hours of pursuit, declining battery power, and worsening air. United States destroyers and aircraft were already positioned around the contact. Searchlights swept across the water and illuminated the dark hull, while American crews watched for identification and any sign of hostile intent. From their perspective, the surfacing marked the successful conclusion of an anti-submarine effort to reveal an unidentified Soviet boat. They did not know with certainty that B-59 carried a nuclear-armed torpedo. For Savitsky, Arkhipov, and the exhausted crew, the situation remained uncertain. They could not know whether surfacing would bring restraint, detention, forced boarding, or attack. United States Navy operational records and Soviet accounts describe signaling, observation, and close surveillance rather than a ceremonial surrender. B-59 did not transfer command or submit to a theatrical capitulation. It surfaced because its batteries required attention, its crew needed air, and its officers had rejected nuclear use under conditions they could not verify. American ships maintained visual control while aircraft continued to circle overhead. The encounter remained tense, but it did not become a destructive exchange. Savitsky regained command control in a new environment. The immediate task was to preserve the boat, restore ventilation, recharge the batteries, and leave without creating another misunderstanding. Arkhipov remained involved as brigade chief of staff. Fresh air and diesel power restored the crew's ability to function after hours of oppressive heat and deteriorating conditions. Signals passed between the American ships and B-59, although the precise meaning of every exchange remains difficult to reconstruct. What is clear is that the submarine was not destroyed or seized. It eventually moved away, still carrying the nuclear torpedo the American force had not known was present. On October 28th, the political crisis began moving toward resolution. Khrushchev announced that the Soviet missile installations in Cuba would be dismantled and removed. The public settlement included a United States commitment not to invade Cuba. Alongside it, a separate and secret understanding anticipated the later removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey without presenting that decision as an immediate public trade. These arrangements gave both governments a path away from direct confrontation. The choice aboard B-59 must be understood within that larger outcome. Arkhipov did not single-handedly operate the torpedo or physically stop a launch at the final second. His opposition and senior judgment helped prevent the submarine from crossing a nuclear threshold at the most dangerous point of the pursuit. A detonation against the United States naval force could have created immediate pressure for retaliation before Washington or Moscow understood how the action had been authorized. No record can prove that World War III would certainly have followed. Political leaders might still have attempted to contain the response. Yet the escalation risk was extraordinary, and control would have become more difficult. That is why Arkhipav's decision may have helped prevent a wider war rather than why historians can claim with certainty that he alone saved the world. As B-59 withdrew, its crew knew the confrontation had included a nuclear weapon. The American sailors who had tracked and signaled the submarine did not. For decades, the most dangerous element of the encounter remained hidden beneath the better-known story of missiles, aircraft, and presidential diplomacy. The surface encounter also revealed how incomplete the American picture had been. Searchlights, aircraft, and destroyers could identify the submarine's nationality and condition, but they could not see the political and nuclear decision that had just occurred below. The Americans observed a diesel-electric boat forced upward by exhaustion. They did not know that their signaling operation had intersected with a weapon capable of changing the character of the entire crisis. When the submarines of Operation Comma returned to the Soviet Union, their crews did not come home as publicly celebrated participants in a nuclear confrontation. The mission remained secret, and later accounts describe criticism or disappointment because several boats had been detected and forced to surface under United States observation. From the perspective of Soviet naval expectations, surfacing could be treated as a failure to preserve concealment, even though the crews had endured severe heat, weakening batteries, equipment trouble, worsening air, and unreliable communication. The nuclear torpedoes were not publicly acknowledged, and the confrontation involving B-59 remained hidden behind the wider history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vasily Arkhipov continued his naval career, later rose to higher rank, and held senior responsibilities. He died in 1998 before the B-59 episode became widely known. Public understanding changed gradually through Russian veteran testimony, declassified United States records, Soviet naval documentation, and archival scholarship. Former officers and crew members described the conditions aboard the submarines and the command dispute surrounding the special torpedo. United States Navy deck logs helped reconstruct the pursuit and the use of signaling charges. The 2002 conference in Havana, held around the 40th anniversary of the crisis, brought American, Soviet, and Cuban participants together and drew major attention to evidence that Soviet submarines near the quarantine line had carried nuclear weapons. Later scholarship compared testimony and documents while identifying uncertainties that remain unresolved. Arkhipov received growing posthumous recognition as a symbol of nuclear restraint. In 2017, members of his family accepted the Future of Life Award in recognition of his role aboard B-59. The phrase, "save the world," is powerful because it expresses the possible scale of what was avoided, but it is a historical interpretation rather than a measurable fact. The record can establish that B-59 carried a nuclear torpedo that Savitsky considered or moved toward its possible use according to later testimony, that Arkhipov opposed that course and helped redirect the decision towards surfacing, and that the American forces nearby did not know they were pressing a nuclear-armed submarine. The record cannot prove how Washington or Moscow would have responded after a detonation. It cannot demonstrate that global war was inevitable. It can only show that such an attack could have triggered retaliation, might have overwhelmed political control, and may have moved the crisis into a far more dangerous phase. That uncertainty is why Arkhipov's role matters. The crisis ended not because every safeguard worked perfectly. A signaling procedure failed to communicate its intended meaning. Radio isolation prevented B-59 from knowing whether diplomacy still held. Heat, weakened batteries, deteriorating air, and exhausted machinery narrowed the time available for judgment. Savitsky faced a situation in which every option seemed dangerous, while Arkhipov insisted that uncertainty was not sufficient authority for irreversible nuclear action. The decision to surface preserved communication, restraint, and political choice. Luck also mattered. The weapon was not used. American crews did not turn the surfacing into a destructive confrontation. Kennedy and Khrushchev reached a settlement before another local incident escaped their control. B-59 therefore remains a warning about command responsibility, flawed communication, mechanical pressure, timing, judgment, and chance. The world moved away from the brink, not because the system functioned perfectly, but because individuals on both sides still made decisions that left room for de-escalation. The episode also complicates the belief that nuclear stability rests mainly on leaders, doctrines, and technical safeguards. Kennedy and Khrushchev mattered, but neither man was present in B-59's control room. Written procedures mattered, but the signaling procedure failed at the point of reception. Weapons controls mattered, but their precise operation remains disputed. What prevented escalation was a chain of human choices made under pressure, with no guarantee that the next decision would be equally restrained.